Thank you for making time and for having us here.
Well, thank you for visiting us at the IMF.
Of course. I want you to take us around the world and kind of give us that global view. Let's start in China. China has been this hub of cheap manufacturing for the world. We are all so dependent on it. But right now, it looks like COVID cases are exploding as they start peeling back those zero COVID restrictions. What will that mean for the global economy, long and short term?
In the short term, bad news. China has slowed down dramatically in 2022 because of this tight zero COVID policy. For the first time in 40 years, China's growth in 2022 is likely to be at or below global growth. That has never happened before. And looking into next year, for 3, 4, 5, 6 months, the relaxation of COVID restrictions would mean bushfire COVID cases throughout China. I was in China last week in a bubble in a city where there is zero COVID, but that is not going to last once the Chinese people start traveling.
Because they don't have an effective vaccine right now.
The vaccinations fall behind. They have not worked on antiviral treatments and how that can be offered to people. And so they will go through this tough time. If they stay the course, and this is our advice, stay the course, over time they would be able to catch up with the rest of the world, both in terms of focusing their vaccinations, bringing mRNA vaccines into China, expanding antiviral treatment, and the economy would function. But for the next couple of months, it would be tough for China, and the impact on Chinese growth would be negative, the impact on the region would be negative, the impact on global growth would be negative.
Because this is the second largest economy in the world, and we've learned how dependent the world is on the Chinese supply chain. So do you expect then a domino effect? Will inflation get worse because all of a sudden there aren't workers healthy enough to go to factories in China?
We expect that there would be counterweight from the sheer opening of the economy, because up to now, the biggest impact on global value chains came from restrictions due to COVID. When you close down a big city or a big port, the repercussions for the economy are significant. Now we would have the impact of people getting sick, not going to work, but the economy would be open. So the expectations we have for China is to gradually move to a higher level of economic performance and finish the year better off than it is going to start the year. But you're absolutely right. The world has relied on China's growth for a long, long, long time. Before COVID, China would deliver 34, 35, 40% of global growth. It is not doing it anymore. It is actually quite stressful for the Asian economies. When I talk to Asian leaders, all of them start with this question: what is going to happen with China? Is China going to return to higher level of growth? And unfortunately, we don't see that happening in a way that would lift up global growth significantly next year.
You said that you fear that we are sleepwalking into a world that is poorer and less secure because of a split in the global economy between the US and China. What do you mean by that? And do you see efforts here in Washington to stop it?
It is very easy to reflect on the benefits of the world being more integrated when we look back. Over the last 3 decades, the world economy tripled because of this reliance on an integrated world economy. Who benefited the most? Emerging markets and developing economies. They quadrupled. but rich countries also benefited. They doubled in size of economy. So we have to be careful not to throw the baby with the bathwater. Yes, the way we have operated created excessive dependency in global chains. We were too focused on cost. How can we make products cheaper? And COVID and then the senseless war Russia started against Ukraine have shown that this is not enough. We cannot just concentrate on what is cheaper. We have to think of the security of supplies. Mm-hmm. And that means diversify the sources of products that make the economy function well, lifting up the level of cost. That economic logic is not only appropriate, it is a must to follow. But we shouldn't go beyond. We shouldn't say, okay, we break the world into blocks. One works here, the other one works there, because the costs are very, very high. We calculated that just trade, limiting trade into 2 blocks, would chop $1.5 trillion from global GDP year after year after year.
If you tried to separate the U.S. and China.
You separate them, there is a excessive cost. So the logic should be where, for security reasons, there has to be careful recalibration of supply chains, do it. But don't go beyond. Don't go into benign areas of products that have no strategic significance, but they benefit the US consumer, they benefit the world economy. And this is what we are arguing for. Don't go in a direction in which this separation would make everybody poorer and the world less secure.
So you're telling Beijing and Washington, figure it out. You can't be in conflict.
What we have seen in Bali is an indication that this...
You're talking about the G20 meeting.
The G20 meeting in Bali, when the two presidents, President Biden and President Xi Jinping, met, they spent 3.5 hours discussing exactly that. Where is the point of contact that makes both countries better off? And where is that there are differences that cannot be breached, and therefore
the US is trying
we have to keep them.
Block some Chinese technology companies from doing business here. They're taking measures that are drawing some pretty bright lines between the US and China. Is that tolerable?
We always prefer countries to seek their common interest in economic integration. And when you start breaking the interactions that are based on fair trade, you harm your own people. You not only harm the Chinese, and therefore it has to be thought through very carefully. Again, I want to be very clear. Some diversification of supplies for the security of supply chains is necessary. COVID taught us this lesson. The war taught us this lesson. So the US is right to look into some areas where strategically they need to guarantee the functioning of the US economy without interruptions. But do that keeping in mind the interests of the American people that would like to still have prices
right,
moderating. And actually, when we think about prices, one good news we have for 2023 is that towards the end of the year, we do expect inflation to trim down. So don't take actions that may be contrary to that trend.
But you are predicting inflation to slow to 6.5% from about 7%. Is that right?
Well, towards the end of the year, we project it would go even further down towards the end of 2023, provided central banks stay the course. Our big worry is that with the economy slowing down globally, we are projecting global growth to go down to 2.7%, maybe even lower next year. Remember, 2021, it was 6%. It dropped to 3.2 this year, 2022, and it will continue to drop down. If central banks get a cold foot and say, oh my God, growth is slowing down, let's slow down the fight against inflation, we risk then inflation to be more persistent. So our message is to central banks, you have to see credible decline in inflation, and only then you can think about recalibrating rate policy.
One of your IMF researchers gave a pretty dire prediction. Overall, this year's shocks will reopen economic wounds that were only partially healed post-pandemic. In short, the worst is yet to come, and for many people, 2023 will feel like a recession. What do we need to brace for?
This is what we see in 2023. For most of the world economy, this is going to be a tough year, tougher than the year we leave behind. Why? Because the three big economies, US, EU, China, are all slowing down simultaneously. The US is most resilient. The US may avoid a recession. We see the labor market remaining quite strong. This is, however, a mixed blessing, because if the labor market is very strong, the Fed may have to keep interest rates tighter for longer to bring inflation down. The EU, very severely hit by the war in Ukraine. Half of the European Union will be in recession next year. China is going to slow down this year further. Next year would be a tough year for China. And that translates into negative trends globally. When we look at the emerging markets and developing economies, there the picture is even direr. Why? Because on top of everything else, they get hit by high interest rates and by the appreciation of the dollar. For those economies that have high level of debt, this is a devastation.
And I want to come back to you on that. And just to explain that for some of our listeners, a stronger dollar, it's good for Americans when they go shopping abroad. It's not good for poor countries who have taken out loans, for example, and borrowed money in dollars. And according to the IMF, 60% of low-income countries are in distress because of this debt. So what does that look like to you? Do you see governments collapsing with defaults? Does that bleed into the global financial system? I mean, how much of a contagion does this become?
So far, the countries that are in that distress are not systemically significant to trigger a debt crisis. Let's just look at the map. Which are these countries? Chad, Ethiopia, Zambia, Ghana, Lebanon, Suriname, Sri Lanka. Very important for their people that we find a resolution to the debt problem, but the risk of contagion is not as high. However, if that list continues to grow, and let's remember 25% of emerging markets are trading in distressed territory, then the world economy may be for a bad surprise. And this is why at the IMF we are working very hard to press for debt resolution for these countries. And we have engaged the traditional creditors, the Paris Club, the non-traditional creditors, China, India, Saudi Arabia. Our call is very simple: urgency. We have to act. When I look at the debt map of the world, yes, we have to be concerned. During COVID, what did we do? Everywhere, governments borrowed, rightly so, to help their people.
Money was cheap.
Money was cheap, and we prevented a collapse of the world economy. That was the right thing to do. But once Russia invaded Ukraine and that added impetus to inflation, money is not cheap anymore. So what is the advice we give to governments? Focus on your budgets. Make sure that you have sufficient revenues to collect and that you spend very wisely.
That's good advice, but it's not always easy politics to
Of course
follow
it
that
is not.
advice, as you know. And so that's why I want to, if you can explain for our viewers, you know, we spoke to the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, Jamie Dimon, recently, and he said he sees the global risk as explosive right now. He was saying things like migration, energy, national security, liquidity in the banking system, war. These are all the knock-on effects of a government not being able to pay its bills and not being able to deliver for its people. Is that what you are seeing too?
What we're seeing is the world has changed dramatically. It is a more shock-prone world. The lessons we learned from the last couple of years are that no more we operate with relative predictability of what the future would bring. And these shocks, COVID, the war, cost of living crisis, they compound their impact. What does that mean for governments? First and foremost, it means that we need to change our mindset towards more resilience, more precautionary actions. And at the IMF, this is what we tell our members: act early. Don't wait until the problems deepen. And for those who need help, this is why we exist. For the developing countries, the fund is a source of resilience. And I'm very pleased that many of our members are coming to us. Just since the war started, we got 16 countries coming for programs to the IMF, $90 billion in support for these countries. And right now we have 36 requests. So that acting early when you see trouble, look for ways to strengthen your fundamentals, to have buffers to protect you and your people. This is the advice we give to governments. For those who don't know the IMF, we were created from the ashes of the Second World War to stabilize the world economy. And at a moment like this, we come strong to help our members. My message, don't think that we are going to go back to pre-COVID predictability. More uncertainty, more overlap of crisis wait for us. Rather than crying for the time we had, we have to buckle up and act in that more agile, precautionary manner I described.
I want to make sure I get to Ukraine because I know we're running out of time. You've said the single most negative factor in the global economy is the war in Ukraine. And Vladimir Putin says this is going to go on for some time. President Zelensky said they need $55 billion in foreign support next year. He expects $20 billion from the IMF. Is he going to get it?
We are working on providing support for Ukraine. So far, out of the international financial institutions, we have provided the largest amount of financing for Ukraine, $2.7 billion in emergency financing, and we are working for 2023 to be a significant part of the support for Ukraine. I expect that sometime early in the year, we will go to our board with a request. We have assessed the needs of Ukraine to range somewhere between $3 and $5 billion a month. What Putin did with destroying critical infrastructure in Ukraine, this is horrific. And it means that in the next months, the country would be more on the high end of this range because it is put in an awful position to have to restore access to electricity, to heat, to water. I have relatives in Ukraine. What I know from them is it is cold, it is dark, and it is scary. bombardments of civilian areas continue. What I also want to say is that Ukraine has proven to be remarkably resilient. The Ukrainian economy is functioning. Pensions are being paid. When there is bombardment, restoration of energy, water, heat is done very quickly. And we see revenues collected in Ukraine in a very disciplined manner to support the
So the
functioning
government's
of
not
the
going
country.
to collapse?
The government is very well functioning under incredibly difficult circumstances. No, they're not going to collapse. And another thing that is so remarkable is actually the world has proven to be more resilient than we feared a year in the beginning of the year. We look at the response to the energy shock in Europe, and Europe is moving towards independence from Russia decisively. Yes, there will be a tough winter. Maybe the next one would be even tougher. But freedom from dependence on Russia is coming. It is going to be there.
I want to ask you two questions before we go. How do you describe the state of U.S. economics and politics?
The U.S. economy, remarkably resilient. Decision-making in the U.S., because of the way the political set is at the moment, it is more difficult. But nonetheless, the U.S. has taken some very important steps that are helping to the U.S. economy, like the child tax, the
tax credit,
the credit that is, it is contributing so significantly to reducing poverty in the U.S., like the infrastructure bill, like the Inflation Reduction Act. These are things that are bringing more dynamism in the U.S., good for the U.S., good for the world. And of course, staying on that course is going to be more challenging, but I do hope that the U.S. is not going to slip into recession despite all these risks. We expect 1/3 of the world economy to be in recession, and yes, as you said, even countries that are not in recession, it would feel like recession for countries of millions of people. But if that resilience of the labor market in the U.S. holds, the U.S. would help the world to get through a very difficult year.
And as I let you go, my final question is, what leaves you hopeful in 2023?
What leaves me hopeful is that I know when we work together, we can overcome the most dramatic challenges. In 2020, the world came together in the face of tremendous threat and was able to overcome this threat. In 2023, we have to do the same. And in this world of ours, of more frequent and devastating shocks, we have to hold hands, we have to work together. And my institution is there to bring economic policymakers so we can be wise and persistent in the face of truly dramatic challenges we face.
Madam Managing Director, thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you.